Our homework has been to think, how do we empower and help you with lessons that exist outside of your borders and that can really catalyze change. So to begin that, we know that, and as executive director of the Public Finance Initiative, I have the privilege of thinking about this every day, and it's the topic of like my life's career. As a public finance professional, where I was an attorney, investment banker, worked within an investment firm, so really on the side that never thought about dollars and cents other than separate from values, to really marry those two disciplines and bring that to this discussion. And we know that a plan without resources is just an aspiration. And here, I think what we've surfaced is that there could be more resources than you're aware of, possibly, and that government action certainly is at the crux of that in multiple dimensions that this could take. So how do you fund your aspirations? And I'm going to start with a basic primer that, in case you've never heard the term public finance, we want to make sure you can participate in this discussion. And then my colleagues are going to guide you through a conversation that says, and how do you not only pay for the things that we've heard are important, but how do you do that? Centering community, centering indigenous practices, really considering that community engagement doesn't just end here. So what is this photo? Think about it. What could it be? Where could it be? How could it be relevant to this discussion? If you're thinking this is an aquifer in Missoula, Montana, you're right. You're right. And this is representative of how a small city took on a financial giant and gained 100% control of their water system after decades of what the mayor described, a water system passing from private investor to private investor who did not care about the community. I am in no way suggesting that is what is happening here. I'm just saying that this is emblematic of one of the few examples in America of a community where the desire in North Star is to go from private to full public control, that it is possible. And that there are also incremental lessons that one can learn. And the biggest takeaway that I had in reading this that surfaced yesterday were one of the predominant pieces from the K&I community was control and ownership need to be re-envisioned and reimagined, is that what does it take beyond political will? It considers that it's important to think about blending and braiding areas of public finance that perhaps you've thought about in a vacuum. So in Missoula, Montana, to not belabor the point, they had to use their powers of eminent domain. They used tools that you use, including appropriations from what's called the General and Governmental Fund. They coupled that with not saying, hey, we're never going to go to investors, but they're now bringing investors in differently, retaining control across certain areas that they had given up before. And it's an example of what's possible when you center the needs and the voices of the community, and that is your aspiration. As a nonprofit, we really take pride in never telling anybody what to do. We say, what is your hope for a path, and how do we help you in view of that? And separate from the priority of control, these are just some of the community needs that were surfaced yesterday, and many of which I'm sure came up in this room, including not only do we need to think about water, but the nexus to housing, the nexus to nature-based solutions, thinking about culture, thinking about individuals who perhaps are facing emotional grief due to the issues that are surfacing around water and displacement, real things that need resources in very different ways. And one of the key things that the county has done historically beyond water is, if you ask yourself, how are we paying for any of these things? There's been a history of advancing what's called pay-as-you-go. And to make sure that we can understand, well, what does that mean and what could you do differently? We're going to tackle 3 questions in the next 15 minutes or so. Is first, how do you leverage public finance for whatever the priorities are on a long-term and short-term basis? Second, what role can something beyond pay-as-you-go, called municipal bonds, play in your strategy? And third, what questions should you be asking as a community or your leaders be asking to realize place-based aspirations when you're putting together new pieces of your financial tool chest like a puzzle? So first, just to make sure that we all have a shared understanding, when I say public finance, it's really simple. I'm talking about the way that government raises and spends money. This is a really, really hard area, but this is a way that you can just, it's the simplest definition you can think of, which is true to what it is. Beyond that, it gets a little bit deeper. You say, well, how does the county fund anything? And the words on this circle represent how any community in America, the county, fund any project, and of course there's a square called other. And I'll describe really briefly what they are. So pay as you go, just as it sounds, you pay for things as you go. So you go to the store, you use cash. You don't use a credit card. Think about that as a human being. Governments do the same thing. Maui County does a lot of pay-as-you-go, particularly for water. Municipal bonds and lending instruments. You go to investors and you ask them to believe in you, to lend you money, and you pay them back. Something called debt service, principal and interest over time for possibly 30, 40 years. You raise a lot of money up front. Land value capture, where you think about land as your biggest resource and you say, what are we doing with real estate markets? And is it the right thing to make sure reinvestment really stays and lives here in the way that we need? Or are we leaving money and opportunity on the table? Public-private partnerships, something you've already seen the history of with Mahipono and others that have really been a fixture of your community and public finance strategy. And then, of course, something that's more emergent. So many of you are familiar with grants where a foundation or a philanthropist can write you a really big check and you don't have to ever pay that money back. You just have to do something in alignment with their mission and yours. But an emergent area that's really powerful for you to consider are program-related investments, where a foundation can come in and beyond grant making, actually become a social investor in community with mission guiding the purpose. And then other tools that we won't cover this evening. So in order to say, well, how do you make sense of this and like what fits here? We want to make sure that you have a shared understanding of the resource base. So does anybody here know, how does the county make money and pay for anything? You're right. Everybody here would get an A on the quiz. So if we were to say, like, let's look at the framework of fiscal governance, or how is government set up to do this fiscal decision making, both raising and spending money, three things become really salient. So Article 8, Chapter 19 of the revised charter of the County of Maui really sets forward the powers of this authority. But then we look at the Department of Water Supply, set up as a separate agency, also within the mayor's executive management. And both of these departments really draw from a larger sense in agency, not only the general fund, but also, as we know, the rate structure behind the water system. And one of the most exciting opportunities, especially to somebody who loves public finance like me, is you are on the precipice of creating an enterprise fund for regional water investment, particularly under that new section of the charter that established the authority, which creates an opportunity, as we're going to talk about, for you to ask really important questions about the future of how you want to fund the system and the role of community. And if I were to look through your 300-page financial documents, as our team did really joyfully to understand you, this is where we would figure out that indeed you are predominantly property, not only property tax, but other tax-owned source revenues is the biggest source of money. It's the blue section of the pie. That's a really good thing. And when you think about it, that's what's been supporting pay-as-you-go. So the ability to really pay for things in real time. So when we say, well, why would you move away from that? And what's your opportunity to start thinking, is that really the right and most best way, particularly when we say the water system will fit within this framework? The top question you might want to start with is, how do you design a rate setting plan for this new regional water system fund? Do you want that money to be used for operations and maintenance? Do you want the flexibility to use that money to secure debt, to raise millions of dollars in one day that you use and lock in for 30, 20, 40 plus years for the projects that matter in the community? Or do you want to continue doing pay-as-you-go for projects that are either just water focused, or do you want to think more expansively? As we started the meeting with Gina mentioning that some people are saying, hey, I want to see a breadbasket in this community, food security and other issues that often don't receive funding in a priority way within a water system become a mandate and charge of the authority where you take leadership. So the benefits of pay-as-you-go is obviously, as you know, you go to the store, you have fiscal discipline, you only spend the money that you have. The risk is, what happens if money isn't appropriated? What happens if it's not enough? What happens if there are other concerns? The way that you solve for that in a community is beginning to understand, and here you see, like, what if we paid for just the things on this chart with pay-as-you-go, and here on the right, what if we did it differently? What if we had more options? What if we started assigning different methods to different pieces of what matters, giving us not only more money that we can keep and use for other purposes, but optionality? And this is something that you can plan for when you set up the structure of that regional fund, particularly as it relates to water and the priorities, including where does education come from? Would you have workforce, opportunities to build in for people who are doing labor, particularly caring for their water system with cultural heritage practices and not being compensated for that? What about systems improvements we've talked about that are part of a regional plan or statewide plan that needs to be thought of? So beyond that, you have an opportunity to think, could we be using an instrument that is being underutilized more? And that's municipal bonds and lending instruments, which must be used carefully. For those who are not familiar with this, let's do a little bit of an exercise. If I was Gina or any leader in Maui, and I would say, how do I meet an investor using a municipal bond? Like, what does that mean? You'd have to do these 9 things. And this would apply to pretty much any government that's a general government at a county, state, local level in the United States. First, you need an idea, like, what is it that you want to pay for? Is it eligible for the tax subsidy that municipal bonds carry, which is why investors really love them? And there's a $4 trillion market of money out there for the taking that is robust, not changing despite political and different economic factors, and a staple of the American infrastructure finance system. And then you want to think about your capacity to go through those 9 squares and basically think, how do we want to sell the deal? How do we structure the capacity to pay investors principal and interest throughout a really long duration? How do we make sure that we're not doing those payments on the back of a rate setting structure that could be inequitable to the community, and which we could come to regret? So you have to ask really hard questions and also make sure that the market believes in you and will let you sell and raise that money, sell the bonds and raise the money at the lowest possible price. And this morning we had a discussion about the county's history in using what are called general obligation bonds. Guess what pays those back? The property tax. So really sort of the pledge to the investor who believes in you and who's going to loan you money. In this case, you have an opportunity with the creation of the regional fund to think, could we raise money from investors and actually begin to think about the rate structure more expansively, so that we don't just do municipal bonds, but we can actually raise money at scale in tandem with other approaches, i.e. giving you a wider suite of tools to pay for the many things that we've heard you need and want. And obviously with all of these approaches, including pay-as-you-go that you see compared here on this chart, the way that you're going to choose between either that or the extent to which you continue down the road of public-private partnerships with Mahi Pono and others, or you diversify towards bringing investors differently through the bond market, where you do not give up control over the water system, but you bring in the resources, will turn upon at least like 3 questions. What is it that you want to do? What are the cost-benefit analysis, the negatives and the positives of each approach? And what are your values? And the values conversation needs to not just be in the project, but also making sure that you are making a financial choice that will not undermine and harm communities in the ways we've heard you've experienced. And separately from that, I went a little too quickly. Can you go back to the slide, please? I think the slide advancer is not working, or there's an error. Sorry for the technical difficulties this evening, but this is authentic community engagement. Well, I'll tell you, part of what I was going to talk about next is with municipal bonds, you also have an opportunity to do something really novel that communities across America, particularly other counties, have been innovating. So let's take the issue of food security, where you could say, hey, micro-entrepreneurship, people in this community, they might have solutions to that, and they might know how to create the bread basket that has been the topic of so many conversations. You could actually create a way for not only taking the money that you would have through pay-as-you-go, bringing in foundations, and creating vehicles in perpetuity that could give people not only the agency to sit in a meeting and say, hey, this is important, but the opportunity to actually receive microloans and to contribute to what it means to actually turn the community into a breadbasket, to think about their agency in affordable housing growth, to think about their agency across a whole number of issues by structuring not only the opportunity to bring in money from the regional fund on a one-time basis where you would give money to the community, but actually creating a vehicle that exists in perpetuity. One of the communities that's done this is Macon-Bibb County, Georgia, and I see that they're trying to bring up the slides. That community specifically recognized that when they use lending vehicles, they could achieve some of the benefits and mitigate the risks that are on this slide. Okay, let me go back. So one of the benefits of thinking about lending instruments when used correctly is that You can not only invest in deferred maintenance at scale, so some of the system improvements that are needed, you can invest in expansion projects. You can actually achieve what's called intergenerational equity, i.e. you think about the future generations that we talked about so intently who should participate in paying for the system and doing so in a way that is fair. You can also engage in asset liability matching, thinking about what is the useful life of the different components of the system. And you can make strategic choices, again, about the way that you pledge revenue so that it's not just the one use of the funds going out of the bank account of the government and this new regional fund. And in leveraging what are called program-related investments from foundations, one of the key things that can do is actually come in and having a partner who will provide you with credit support so that the market can actually believe that not only will you stand behind the obligation, but that you could actually raise money at the lowest possible price, because that is at the heart of what future generations will look to for that liability, i.e. that you have not created a cost burden where we already have heard the issues that the community is facing. And this is typically just kind of a really simple diagram of the three components that you would bring together like a puzzle to really create a perpetual fund that, supported by your regional fund, could actually create the opportunity for food insecurity and other issues to really be put into the hands of the community in a really meaningful way. So I will end the presentation here and just mention that our goal here today is not to be prescriptive and tell you do this, do that, but to help you think, how do you use every arrow in the quiver differently, including the ones that you may be leaving on the table. And as my colleague Carletta Chief will explain, to do so with awareness and attention to cultural heritage practices and so many other pieces that are going to be surfaced in our conversation. So Dr. Chief, I'm going to turn it over to you.